Hi, everyone. It's so happy to have you here. I'm Stephanie Sandala. I am Programming and Outreach Specialist for Library Link NJ. I'm thrilled to introduce you to Rick Martinez and Erin Jean McDowell. Rick is the host of the companion video series, Mi Cocina and Sweet Heat, both on the Food 52 YouTube channel. He co-hosts the Borderline Salty podcast with Carla Lolly Music, whose cookbooks are great, by the way, is a regular contributor for the New York Times, and teaches live weekly cooking classes for Food Network Kitchen. He currently resides in Mazatlan with his dog Choco, where he cooks, eats, and enjoys the Mexican Pacific coast. And his background is amazing, by the way, as we're just appreciating it right now. Erin Jean McDowell teaches weekly baking classes on Food Network Kitchen and hosts the series Bake It Up a Notch for Food 52. Her first book, The Fearless Baker, was named one of the best baking books of the year by the New York Times. Her most recent books, The Book on Pie, one of my favorites, by the way, and Savory Baking, are New York Times bestsellers. She is based in the New York metro area, where she lives with her husband, Derek, and pup, Brimley.
Not anymore, actually. I'm no longer in New York, but other than that was all true.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, no. Okay. She lives in the Midwest with her husband, Derek, and pup Brimley.
Yeah,
there we go.
That was true at the time that I wrote it. I promise.
Yes. And our moderator
is the pup near you now? Oh, sorry.
He's actually not. He was he's being a little frisky today, so I couldn't trust him to not be well behaved during this call.
Oh my God, Rick. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
He's always next to me, usually sleeping.
Beautiful boy.
Yes, so amazing. Yes, and our moderator today is librarian Christy Chadwick, who has moderated with us before and is amazing, and will take it away.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everybody. It is great to be back here again. Unfortunately, my dog is actually in her crate asleep, so she will probably not be joining us today, but who knows how that may be at the end. So I am thrilled to have a series of questions for both of our cooks here today. And I'm just going to start us off right with our first one, which is going to be for both of you. And Erin, I'll have you take it first. So for those of you who have joined us at our webinar, some of them may not have a lot of knowledge of your work. So could each of you talk a little bit about yourself and your experience, and maybe share a couple of people who have inspired you along the way?
Definitely. I have fallen in love with food from a very young age. And when I was growing up, I actually dreamed of being like two of my older brothers who are artists. And I thought, I want to be an artist. And then when it kind of clicked that food was an art form, everything sort of fell into place for me. I got my first job in a bakery when I was 16 years old. And then I was lucky enough to attend pastry school. After I graduated high school, I went to the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York. While I was there, I realized that I could combine my love of writing with my love of food. And I decided to kind of plunge deeper into the food media sort of world. And so immediately upon graduating from pastry school, that's what I did. I have worked in bakeries, I've worked in restaurants, but I've been lucky enough to be working in food media for over 10 years. I've written 3 books, which is sort of the main thing that I always love to chat about, but I also write a lot for a lot of different outlets, a lot of the same outlets that Rick does. We have a lot of parallels, especially in our more recent years of our resumes. And then, of course, I host my web series, Bake It Up a Notch. My work is really about trying to share the joy that I feel when I'm baking in the kitchen with as many people as possible, including those people who maybe are scared of baking and think that they can't do it. I also really want to kind of break people out of the frame of mind that baking is incredibly difficult, and instead allow people to see where they can get creative with it and make things their own the same way they might when they are cooking in the kitchen. So that's sort of who I am and what I'm about. And I now live in Kansas City. I've actually talked with Rick a lot about this because I was so inspired by Rick's move when he first moved to Mexico that I said, I dream of kind of moving home someday instead of being based in New York, where I had been for almost 17 years. And so just this
Wow.
past year, I moved back and I bought my first home with my husband, and we live here now. And all of these behind me are sprinkles.
Yay, the sprinkle
Nice.
cabinet.
Love it. Thanks, Erin. Rick, go ahead.
Well, I don't have a sprinkle cabinet, but I have a cabinet of chilies that's probably not quite as big, but getting there. So my name is Rick Martinez, and super excited that Erin and I are here today because we're friends in real life. And I also have a deep passion for baking. Really, what it comes down to is I love to eat sweets. I have a crazy sweet tooth, and therefore it's easier for me to just figure out how to make something than to go buy it. And I love the challenge of baking as well. But what I probably do the most is savory foods. And I grew up in Texas. I was born in Austin, Texas. I grew up in Texas. And, I used to religiously watch Rick Bayless and Diana Kennedy on PBS, their shows. And, I have the utmost respect for both of them and their knowledge. But one of the things that had always bothered me as a Mexican-American boy growing up is that, I didn't see Mexican-Americans or Mexicans representing the food and the culture of Mexico. And it was difficult for me, again, with the most respect for both of them and seeing their shows. Diana Kennedy lived in Michoacan, which is a state in Mexico. And I loved her house. I loved her kitchen. She would go to the markets. And I remember as a 19-year-old boy thinking, I want that. I want to have that kitchen in Mexico. I want to go to the markets every morning and buy that fresh produce and the fresh proteins and cook in my kitchen in Mexico, that Mexican food. And so that had sort of stuck with me. And, my parents were pretty against me going down the food or the culinary career path. I had interviewed with the CIA, the Culinary Institute of America, and my parents were like, no, get a business degree, just get your degree in college, and then, do something normal, and then, you can always change later. So I did, and I ended up working in advertising for 16 years. So I lived a very Mad Men lifestyle. I moved to New York when I was 26. Lived there for 20 years and worked in advertising for 16, and then sort of just decided one day, you know what? I'm nearing 40 years old, and I do not want to have the regret that I never tried working in food. And so I applied to culinary school, got accepted at French Culinary Institute in New York. I had a very expensive apartment in New York that I could no longer afford on a student and cook salary. So I let that go. The day that I told my parents I was doing that, my mom pretty much couldn't talk to me anymore. She handed the phone to my dad and was like, here, you talk to him. And, and it was literally one of the hardest things I'd ever done because, I was used to a lifestyle. I had, I was doing very well in advertising and I enjoyed it, but, the passion, the desire to cook food, both for myself and for other people was really strong. And it just kept getting stronger the older I got. And so at a certain point, I was just like, I just have to do this, and I can always go back, but I need to do this. And then I had another moment again when I wrote my cookbook, Mi Cocina. I bought a car in Mexico City in 2019 and drove around the country. I drove around Mexico, so I visited all 32 states. At this point, more than 300 cities and small towns, exploring the food and the cuisine. And when the pandemic started, I was in the northern part of the country and I was like, okay, do I go back and get trapped in my apartment in New York, or do I stay here? And I decided I wanted to be by a beach. If I was going to have to quarantine, I wanted to be next to a beach. And so I drove to Mazatlan. I'd never been here before. I didn't know anybody. And I just, I got here on March 19th and I stayed here. Well, I never left. So that was that. And I passed this house. I was renting an Airbnb, and I passed this house on my way to the market every morning, and it was for sale. And because of the pandemic, nobody was obviously buying houses in foreign countries at that point. So the price kept dropping, and then I was like, you know what, I'm going to make an offer and see what happens. And then that's how it happened. So it was a pandemic move, but it was one of the best things that I've ever done in my entire life. I just feel so much freer to be me, to cook the food that I want to cook, to do the jobs that I want to do. And I mean, and thankfully I can, cook and write from here. I go back to the US when I need to, but yeah, it's been a really great experience for me here.
That's great. This actually kind of continues in with my next question, which is for you, Rick. I had wanted to know a little bit more about, how Mi Cocina came about in the creation, which you really told it wonderfully in the book, in the beginning of it. And you shared some of those details in there, but I was going to ask for highlights, but I kind of want to know actually a little more specifically, talk about driving in a car through Mexico, and just kind of, did you have to live out of the car, or did you actually stay in different places, and how that experience went for you?
Sure. So just to back up a little bit, because I grew up in Texas, and, because I'm a Mexican American, I thought that what we ate, because people always believed and said to me, you are a representative of Mexico. So when everybody had a question about Mexico or Latinos in general, they always would ask me, well, what do you think, Puerto Ricans would think about this? And it's like, well, I don't know. Like, A, I'm not Puerto Rican, and B, like, I can only tell you what I think. But I grew up believing that my family was, sort of the poster child for, or poster family for Mexicans. And the first time that I visited Mexico, like further into, the central part of the country, I was like, what is this food? Nobody looks like us here. And none of this food is familiar to me. None of these flavors, none of these ingredients are familiar. And I didn't understand. I was aware of Tex-Mex, but I thought that what we ate was representative. I mean, I think it's very similar to, 40 years ago, Italian food in the US was red sauce, right? And then, the same thing, if you went to Italy and you were expecting spaghetti and meatballs and pizza, and then you go there and it's like, oh, there's so much more. And it's like, it's also, the things are so different than they are here. And that was what happened to me. And so there was a part of me that really wanted to understand my culture and my place in it. Like, where did I come from? Where did my family come from? Where did our traditions come from? And that was a big motivation for wanting to, A, write the book, but also do the research for the book. Frankly, the publisher would have preferred if I had just sat in my apartment in New York and written, all 104 recipes without any delay, and the expense of going to Mexico. But I was like, no, like there are enough Mexican cookbooks in existence where the authors did not do the work. And I was not going to do that. And I wanted, and like I said, I mean, it was very personal as well. And so, so I always knew that I was going to do it. And then, when you get to the point, it's like you're standing at the edge of a cliff, and, and I had to figure out the logistics. Like, do I rent a car? Do I buy a car? Do I take the bus? Do I fly? Like, and in the end, I decided to buy a used car because that was the most economical. I decided to stay in Airbnbs because I feel like you get a better sense of the country when you're actually staying in someone's home, and I mean, I guess there is a bit of a voyeuristic element to it, but, I think rather than staying in a sterile apartment or a hotel, when you're living in someone's home and you see the way that kitchens are laid out, you see the things that they use to cook, you get a better sense for the country, and also how those things change from location to location, state to state, region to region. And I had, by probably about, a month or two into the trip, I got very good at creating sort of a very, at least for me, a sort of pseudo-scientific approach to it. I did a lot of desk research. I had, I would go to a region. I knew the cities that I wanted to visit because of, the food that existed in those cities. I knew where the major markets were. I found that staying near the markets was always best. A lot of times in these towns, the market is the center of the town. Usually, in Mexico, towns were founded with markets and churches. So where there's a big cathedral, there's always a market right next to it. And so you go talk to God, then you go to the market and you buy your food. And so that's kind of, that to me was the epicenter of where I needed to be. It was the beginning of each of these small towns that, they then eventually grew into millions of people, cities of millions of people. But the heart of the culinary history seemed to always be located in those areas. And so that's where I started. I can figure out a lot about the city and the culture and the people by the market. And at this point, I know which markets, I can walk into a market and, oh, these are the things that they like. These are the things that they don't like. This is how it compares to a different state or a different region. And also the quality of food. There was one city that I visited in Mexico that I was just frankly pretty horrified at the state of the food. And it is a beautiful town, but the town is much more into the tourists than the food. And it's a silver mining town. So they mine silver, they make beautiful jewelry and silver items, but food is just not important. And it was very evident in the quality of the food, the way that it was handled. People just didn't care about what they were eating. They just wanted to have a beautiful town with really beautiful silver items. And so, and a lot of times, like one thing that I started doing is I would ask the owner of the Airbnb, I would say, okay, I'm writing a cookbook, I'm doing this research. Do you know anybody? Do you, are there places that you think I should visit? And invariably, they would introduce me to, their cousin who got married, who had an uncle who made barbacoa for their wedding. And then I would drive to that small town, meet that person, and that person would say, go meet this farmer who knows this person who makes this thing. And it was amazing. I met so many people just by doing that. And I found, I tried to organize the trip, very systematically. And then I just decided, I can't. I need to allow for being able to meet people and travel to small towns. And so that's pretty much how it went for, up until the pandemic happened. And then I kind of had to stop and wait that out.
That is like an incredible experience. Like you hear about people doing different things and doing research, but this is definitely a unique one for me. Thank you. Erin, so let's talk about savory baking. This is a topic that I think many people may think that you wouldn't be able to actually fill a cookbook with savory baking. What do you say to people who always think that baking equates dessert?
I have a lot of practice with this because, in fact, when I was pitching this cookbook, I was rejected a whopping 11 times before it was finally accepted.
Oh my God. And
one of the reasons that this idea kept getting rejected was I heard repeatedly like, oh, that's just a chapter of a book. That's just and that was very frustrating for me because I had seen that across the board. I think, unfortunately, in cookbooks, sometimes it does seem like there's a little bit of oh, well, that hasn't been done before. Like that's a bad thing. Like actually, when it hasn't been done before and there's so many books on the market, that should make it like something we really want to do. So there also, I always have to bring this up because in a lot of places in the world, a lot of different cultures, there are more savory baked goods than there are sweet baked goods. So it really just depends where you are in the world and what lens you're looking at it through. I think definitely in America, we think of baking as desserts, but even the world of bread, for example, baking bread, most bread items I tend to think of skew a little bit more savory because even how we're using this bread, is it a sandwich bread? Is it, is it stuffed with some kind of filling? So obviously you can go sweet, you can go savory. Both are, very plentiful, rich subject areas. And in particular with this book, one of the things that I wanted to do was also show people it's always kind of my goal to show some level of flexibility in baking. So I actually do have these sweet tooth breaks all throughout the book where it's like, yes, this is, we're using this in a more savory application, but the dough is a brioche dough, and brioche actually can make a wonderful variety of sweet baked goods as well. So I definitely never have a problem with the quantity of ideas. In fact, I think we had to cut almost 50 total recipes from this book to make it fit into the size that it is. But with that said, it's just because it is an extremely rich subject area. There's so much you can do. There's so many directions that you can go. And also there's a lot of great opportunity for those base recipes. So for example, things like just a basic concept like a muffin. Well, obviously a muffin can really be what you make it. So not only do I have a muffin, I sort of have this base recipe where it's like, okay, now make it your own. What do you have in the fridge? What do you want to use up? What are you feeling like this week? That sort of thing. So when I finally was able to write this savory book, I had been rejected so many times that I had just decided I'm going to keep working on it anyway, because I really think it's an amazing idea. And I knew that passion and that fire of wanting to do it was going to make some really awesome recipes. So I kept working on it, and I had been working on this book on and off, whenever I could for more than 5 years before I finally got kind of the green light to send any idea I wanted. And I was like, we're going to do savory baking. So that was how it came to be.
Great. I want to follow that up with something that you had talked about at the beginning when you introduced yourself, and you alluded to here a little bit, is kind of how people may find baking as really daunting. They think of it as a science. I used to have a t-shirt that says baking is a science. And it's less apt for mistakes or being imprecise. But you mentioned you have a lot of customizations for many of the recipes, including the sweet versions. So can we talk a little bit about how baking can be flexible while still needing some of that kind of scientific part of it so that it's less scary?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and the two aren't mutually exclusive. Like, I actually believe that understanding a little bit of the science is what helps you understand how to riff on recipes, how to customize them and make them your own. Forgive me, I do have a tiny bit of a cold, so I may have to clear my throat once or twice during these answers. I was so grateful when Rick was talking. I was like, oh, I can mute myself and just not alarm anyone with my coughs. Excuse me. So one of the things that I really think is that it's the total quantity of the science and the chemistry that people feel they need to understand that makes something so scary. But the reality of the situation is you don't really need to understand all of the science. You just need to understand why it is necessary, why things work the way they do. So my first book, which is called The Fearless Baker, that was sort of the goal of that book, was instead of just telling you how to do something, I'm going to tell you why you're doing it. So why do we mix this way? Why do we let it cool? Why do we not want to add a hot pie filling to a cold pie crust? I mean, and some of those things are obvious, but for a lot of people, they end up having these light bulb moments, is what I always think of them as, of like, oh, that's the one thing I've been doing wrong this whole time. And now I understand why I was doing it wrong. And the thing is, I think in cooking, when you make mistakes or when you don't follow a recipe exactly, you're even sometimes rewarded because you naturally are able to go more towards your own taste. So even when you go and you stray a little bit, you end up liking it a little bit more because you customized it to your taste. But with baking recipes, I feel like people are so afraid to kind of veer away from it. And I definitely don't recommend the very first time you try making a recipe, just like substituting a bunch of the ingredients. That's not a surefire way to become less scared with baking. I think the best thing to do is to actually make a number of recipes and start to kind of like get that muscle memory with baking going a little bit. A lot of people come to me and they say, I baked a great pie last Thanksgiving, but this Thanksgiving it was terrible. But they baked no pies in between. It was just one Thanksgiving, they hit the nail on the head, and the next Thanksgiving, it was terrible. And one of the things that I say is it's muscle memory. You have to make more than one. You even might want to make a few different recipes from a few different people, and you'll start to see what you like about it. And you're also going to start to understand that science at an inherent level without even necessarily having to know the chemistry. You don't need to know all of those details. You just need to know why this butter needs to be cold and this milk needs to be warm, and that, like whatever that is, whatever those instructions are. My best all-purpose advice for people baking is just to read the recipe all the way through before you start. And it's very simple, and a lot of people say that, but you'd be amazed how many people have stumbles and along the way and get frustrated just because they reach a step and they don't have that piece of equipment, or they don't have that ingredient, or it's going to take longer than they thought. So that's one of the things that I think you have to kind of understand some of what's going on, but only in the name of being able to know, okay, well, I like a bread with, this texture. So how am I going to make that happen? Or some of my favorite ways to adapt things are actually ways that it can make it easier for your life. So a lot of people tell me they're scared of yeast and making bread, when in reality, if you understand how yeast works, you can mix a dough, put it in the fridge, and forget about it for 2 or 3 days and end up with an amazing loaf on the other side. But a lot of people would be too scared to do that because the recipe says rise it for 2 hours. Like they don't know how to make those adjustments. So in addition to my books and covering all of these variations, I'm not only hoping that maybe some people will make those variations, I'm also hoping it'll spark an idea where you'll think, oh, instead of that, I could use that. And I think that would work here, and kind of send you off on those directions. And then just like cooking, remember that when you make a mistake, it's not necessarily a loss. I think with baking, it's like, oh no, I wasted all that butter, or I wasted all of this. But very often when you have a failure of some sort in baking, it still tastes pretty good, like a lot of times. So yes, there are times you burn it and you've ruined it, but I feel like that is only a small percentage of the time. The rest of the time, what you get from it, even if it doesn't turn out 100%, is that lesson. Oh, this needed to actually bake for like 10 minutes more to be better. Whatever, how you kind of take that away from it. And in my series, Bake It Up a Notch, I try to show mistakes, because I think that's one thing that people don't do in baking as much. We might even get it sometimes on the culinary side of things, of like, don't sear meat like this, sear it like this. But people don't do that as much in baking. They don't show you what it looks like when the pie is too runny, or when it isn't sufficiently baked, or when it's still doughy in the center, when it's overproofed, underproofed, all of these things. So that's actually the hardest part about making my web series, is we have to intentionally make all of these mistakes and line them up just right in a way that is effective. But I think when people see those mistakes, that's also sometimes the way that they know, oh, that's what I did wrong. That's what mine looked like. Okay, I need to let it rise longer next time. I need to let it. So I think it's all about understanding kind of the pieces and the tools, and heading into the kitchen without that fear, but instead heading into it thinking, I'm making something from scratch, and I'm going to learn something really cool along the way.
No, I think that's really great, because, I totally agree with you about, I was one of those people who didn't read the recipe through for a long time. And
me too.
I know, I got over that finally, but definitely the idea of like being able to see what a mistake could look like is so important for those of us who aren't in the kitchen as much. And that really kind of lends to the learning process just as much as actually creating the items too. So thanks. So Rick, back to you. One of the things you did state in the book is that each dish is something that you did eat during your trip, but you use your own personal style and references. So tell me what your thoughts are about how important putting your own personality into these recipes is to you, and how important should that be to other people who are doing cooking?
I think it's a great question because I mean, the reality is, I believe, and I think we saw this even more during the pandemic when there were shortages of certain ingredients that people couldn't access. So people began cooking even more improvisationally, right? So you couldn't find the canned tomato. So what am I going to use instead of the canned tomato, or, whatever. And I think people got used to that. I mean, I think it was happening before, but I think the pandemic sort of forced a lot of people to improvise more than they probably had been doing before. And I think also, certainly myself, and I know a number of my friends that are professional cooks, would get very indignant when we would write a recipe and then, comments on the recipe online were like, well, this recipe doesn't work. I subbed this, and this, and, or whatever. And, like during the pandemic, I changed my perspective of the way I feel about cooks. Like, I want you to use my recipes as a basic guide, right? But I want you to feel free to improvise and make it your own, because, if I tell you to use a chili guajillo and all you have are chili anchos, I presume that you have them because you like them. And if you use that instead of a chili guajillo, probably there's a higher degree of likelihood that you're going to like the finished product more than if you use the guajillo. I mean, that might not be true, but I just feel like if you already have an ingredient that you're buying and you like, it's probably going to taste good to you. So that was something that influenced me. The fact that it was difficult to find certain things, the fact that even living in Mazatlan, Mexico, which is in the northwest part of the country, there are Mexican ingredients that are difficult for me to find here that I have to specially order. And so I wanted to make recipes that were easy for people to make in the United States. I didn't want you to have to buy special equipment. I didn't want you to have to special order ingredients. I wanted you to be able to go to your local grocery store and find everything easily and make it at home. Because frankly, I think that it is easier, and I would rather you buy a ticket to go visit Oaxaca and taste the moles there than to spend $100 on ingredients from Amazon that are going to be old and maybe a little bit dodgy. And the reality is you're also never going to get the result that you would find in the place. Like there was a moment I was visiting a farm, and so this gentleman, he grew a number of things, but one of the thing that I was there for and really interested in is he grew Mexican cinnamon, which is Ceylon cinnamon. And so they were harvesting it. They had cut the branches off these young trees. They were letting it dry, and then they showed me how to peel the bark, and it was just an incredible experience. So that was why I was there. But then his wife and sister were making lunch for me, which I didn't know. And it was it was one of the most simple lunches in terms of numbers of ingredients and probably the preparation. So it was a chicken soup. It was basically like a chicken simmered in water and maybe a couple of spices, but probably just salt and chicken and water. And then tortillas, and then a goat cheese that they had made. And that was it. But the chicken was killed that morning and then plucked and then cooked. The corn was grown in their field, and the goats had been milked to make that cheese, right? So I could have very easily written a recipe for that lunch. That was one of the most delicious things that I'd eaten in my trip, but no one on earth could ever reproduce that meal unless you had all those things like running around and growing in your yard. So, and that was a good lesson for me, because I had to let go of this idea that I could reproduce, even for myself, that same thing that I ate somewhere. And certainly someone in the US, you know, I mean, like someone in Illinois or Michigan during winter is never going to be able to find good tomatoes to make that salsa, you know, and or so that I'm not going to write that recipe is what I decided. And then and then apart from that, I have learned to really hate the word authenticity, because I don't believe in the context of food in Mexico that it exists. I believe that marketers in the United States used the word authentic as a marketing superlative for books of non-traditional white American cuisine. And so in the case of Mexican cookbooks, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books that are, either have in the title or the subtitle, genuine, authentic, real. And even, and that's how they wanted to market my book. And we had that marketing meeting. And I was like, no, you're absolutely not putting those superlatives on my book, because, I went into this investigation of Mexican cuisine looking for that one definitive version of a dish, and they don't exist. If I asked 10 people in Mazatlan to make the same dish and to bring it to my house, there would be 10 very unique and distinctly different dishes, all having the same name. And those people would eat that food and would appreciate the differences and celebrate the differences and go, oh, I'm going to start doing that, or I'm going to steal this idea, or, and there's no one's going to fight and say that my version is more correct than your version. And so when I decided the structure of the book, this idea that I'm going to write recipes for the dishes that I most loved during my trip, I was very careful. I didn't want anybody to think or believe that I took recipes for anybody, or that I was copying down what they were doing or what I saw, because I'm a cook, and I know what that would do if someone took a recipe of mine and then started cooking it in their restaurant, or put it in another book or a magazine. So that was definitely off the table. But then also understanding that I wanted to make a version of this dish that was both a love letter to the person that cooked it for me, but also that it was going to be easy for someone in Iowa to make. And also, like, it's my recipe. Like, there were things like there's a recipe for caldillo duranguense, which is this really, really beautiful beef stew. And I had a version that in Durango that had, it was a green version. Most of the others were either brown or red. This one used tomatillos, and I thought that flavor really cut the richness from through the beef. I also happen to love oxtails, and I was like, you know what? If I make a sauce with that sort of acidity and hit of chilies and roasted poblanos, I'm going to use oxtails because I love them, And I mean, people can use whatever they want. They can use chuck roast, and I say that in the recipe. This is what I use, but use what you have or what you like. And so that to me is a really good example of, it's like I am paying homage to the dish and to the person that made it for me, but it's very much mine. And I also feel like that I want you to make it very much yours when you make it.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to recipes of, brought from a family, brought from different generations and shared with others, I think that really is one of the big things that speaks with cooking or baking in general. And you mentioned love letters. And I think that this book, Rick, is a love letter to your family, those who came up from Mexico to the US, and how that affected you growing up. It's really, you talked about your mother and her influence on your career and your passion for cooking, and about your identity, how it affected it past, present, and future. So just a few words kind of about how your identity felt when kind of maybe when you started this book and what place you're in now.
Oh, wow. I mean, pretty much night and day. You know, when I started the book, the contract that I signed for this book was cookable modern Mexican. At that time, you know, this was beginning of 2019 that I signed it. You know, I believed, and my agent believed, that I had to make concessions about the type of food that I was going to cook. So they were going to be quick recipes. They were going to be, you know, less fattening recipes, less meat, more veg, weeknight friendly. You know, all of these conditions, right? That make Mexican food more approachable, more modern, more cookable. All of these things that I now despise. Right? I was complicit in that. I signed that contract. I agreed to do this. And, you know, all of the things that happened between the moment that I signed the contract and, you know, the time that I actually started to write the recipes brought me to a point where, you know, I just decided I'm not going to do this. And I had that discussion with the publisher. Like, I'm not going to let you use the word authentic to describe this book. I have tried, at that moment, I had tried to write the quintessential, most authentic version of some of the recipes, and they were lifeless. They had no soul. They were trying to, you know, they were trying to be something that didn't exist. You know, they were trying to take bits and pieces of what I thought was the authentic version and Frankenstein it together to appease a publisher so that they could put a title, you know, a word in front of it. I was like, I'm not going to do that. And if you need your advance back, I will sadly give that back to you. And I will figure out a way to publish this book, or I'll do something else with these recipes. But I'm not going to do that for you, because that's not who I am. It was who I was in 2019, but in 2020, that's not the person that I wanted to be. And that was not the book that I was going to enjoy writing, nor would it have been the book that I would have been proud of. And they said, okay, then what is it that you want to write? And then that's, you know, originally there weren't going to be the type of essays that exist in the book now. You know, it was going to be more of a travel log kind of style book, with these quick and easy, you know, here's what I ate along the way. Then I changed it to be whatever. So, you know, like, so the way that I am now is I'm not hiding myself anymore. I'm going to be the person that I am, I'm going to live my truth, and you're either going to like it or you're not. And it's fine, right? I'm fine with that, you know. And the funny thing is that for most of my career, I felt like I had to try and be something that I am not. And the moment that I stopped doing that and started to be me, the more people were attracted to me and my food and my life. And I think that's probably true for anyone that decides to just shed all of that baggage and be who they really are. I think if you're true to yourself, people are attracted to that truth and the courage that it takes to be that.
Yeah, definitely, Rick. Thank you. I can definitely say that I think all of us appreciate who you are. We appreciated you then, but we definitely appreciate who you are now. Thank you. Erin, I mean, you told us a little bit that the trip to making Savoring Baking, which maybe not the same as Rick, but it really was a passion project for you to go through 11 rejections and stuff. So I think it's great that, you know, bringing cookbooks that are that meaningful and personal to you is really important to put on the shelves and share with other people. that was more of an aside, but I want to talk to you about your first chapter, because you call it Easy and Essential Bakes. And I think that there are definitely things that people feel like they always need to know, as you put it, back pocket well. Have that in your back pocket, know how to do it, right off the top of their head. I still don't know how my grandfather made donuts that way, but he did. But what do you think are some baking essentials that people need to know?
For me, and maybe this is because of where I grew up, but I feel like a good biscuit is one, because you can do so many things with it. You can serve it, as a full meal, something like biscuits and gravy or something. You can use it, almost like a sandwich. You can use it as a dinner roll. So it can serve kind of a lot of purposes. And because of that, I don't have just one biscuit recipe. I have several types. Even within that chapter, also because there are different types. And that's one of the ways, again, that I try to teach people, if somebody's always saying, hi, my grandma used to make a biscuit this way, and I never got the recipe exactly like it. And it's like, it's fun sometimes to be able to show people several things side by side and have them be like, that's the one I think of when I think of a good biscuit, like something like that. There's also, I always like to try to include different levels of effort. So there's a biscuit that's like a drop biscuit that is very, very simple, all one bowl, just takes a few minutes. And then the more traditional flaky biscuit definitely takes longer time, requires chilling, things like that. But if you wanted to go from 0 to biscuit in 30 minutes, there is a recipe in there that could accomplish that. I also think one of the ones that has been really fun for me to watch a lot of people make is the savory Dutch baby, which is in that first chapter. I think it's like, again, that's something that for whatever reason, a lot of people, when they hear Dutch baby, they specifically think of powdered sugar and lemon, when in reality, a Dutch baby is also, essentially a Yorkshire pudding. It's essentially a popover. These are all kind of in the same category and just baked in different ways. So my Dutch baby, and this is something that I do often, is to put bacon and eggs on the top. And I just put it right on the top, and then everyone gets a slice of the Dutch baby with an egg and bacon, and then you eat it all as one thing. And a lot of people have made that. And I think it's because of the actual very little time effort that's involved, but also because it's at the beginning of the book. I think a lot of people crack it. They're like, that one looks easy. I'm going to make that tonight. And they just go and they do it. So it's been fun seeing the high number of people who've made that recipe. And I don't know that I would have called that one essential before, but now I feel like there is something to that. If you can make pancakes, you can make a Dutch baby. So for a lot of people, that doesn't even feel like baking. It just feels like something that's very attainable and achievable. One of the recipes that I think is the most essential and that I make the most often in that chapter is the spoon bread. It's definitely a regional thing also, that not everybody makes the same way. There's lots of different versions, but it isn't really a bread at all. It's more like a souffle. But again, that word would scare the heck out of so many people. And it's not really a souffle, but it is really, really wonderful, just lightly sweet, very fluffy. It can go alongside any number of kind of meal options. So there's so many. I mean, the thing that was difficult for me about this book was actually deciding how to organize it, because I think you can go so many ways with something that is a broad topic like that. Like I sort of like sometimes when chapters are like crispy, crunchy, chewy, like that sort of appeals to me, only because that's sometimes how I enter a book, of sort of like, I'm craving something spicy. Where am I going to find that amongst these items? So I sort of like when people divvy things up that way, but it's more my style to give things in a very informational way. So I kind of ended up dividing it more by overall kind of types of pastries. And the hardest part for me is there's this stage of cookbook writing where I have all of the flavors I want to do and all of the types of baked goods that I want to do. And I'm kind of like putting them together and figuring out which one should go where and which one should be which. And I always have a really hard time making sure that there's an equal distribution of all 4 seasons and an equal distribution of levels of easy, medium, and hard difficulty. I just want everything to be as even as possible. And that's always like a challenge in that very early stage. When I finally set the recipe list, I feel this like great sense of calm, like, now all I have to do is write it. But there's something about that stage at the beginning that is like, I literally could just agonize with a pile of Post-its for weeks if I was given the opportunity, just to make sure that everything is just right and distributed just right. So when it comes to things that are essential, I think that also kind of is defined by your lifestyle and what you like to eat, what you like to make. Because for me, even though they're not as easy, some of the things that I think are the most essential are things that they take a little bit more time, but I enjoy spending that time doing that project. And then I can freeze some, or I can save it for later, and I can use it in a lot of different ways. So I think that can still vary from person to person a bit. And the idea is maybe to just cast a broad enough net that there's going to be something in there that captures you and also inspires you to maybe to make it your own, to make it creative.
Okay. We do have some questions from our attendees. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is for both of you. And this person says, baking sweets has always been easy for them. Good on you. I wish I could say the same thing, but they love to bake savory items more. Is there a way to calculate the amount of salt that would go into a dough? They always find it difficult, especially if the recipe says salt to taste.
Man, a recipe shouldn't say salt to taste for dough. That's a bad recipe. My first advice is get rid of that recipe. And if it was your grandma's, I'm so sorry, because sometimes grandmas didn't keep good track of the amount of salt because they were just like, it's this much. Yeah, typically something that has a ratio like that is a dough. I would never, for a bread recipe, it would completely change the bread recipe. It would change the pie dough recipe to not have a sufficient amount of salt. So that's actually also why so many baking recipes recommend that you use unsalted butter. It's just because every salted butter is slightly different. So if you're using a salted butter, as long as you know it and you know kind of the level of it, you should be fine. But there are ratios for some types of doughs. So especially some bread doughs, there's a recommended kind of percentage, but that isn't necessarily true across the board for things like cakes, cookies. I mean, you see nowadays, I love how many people just put flaky salt all over their cookies. You know, that wasn't ever anything that was listed on the back of the Toll House bag when I was growing up, certainly. So anyway, I think I would recommend when you're baking, looking for recipes that give you a guidance for that, but also remember that the lack of salt can have really detrimental consequences. So you definitely want to use enough salt. And I think sometimes in baking, especially, people think, oh, it's only a quarter teaspoon or it's only a half teaspoon. It doesn't make a difference. It makes such a difference. It's literally flavoring everything, including the more bland, mild ingredients like flour. So we definitely need it in there. What do you think, Rick?
No, I agree. I mean, I think I am very, very particular with salt, and I fought my publisher for a long time with salt or about salt. So I'm a very big proponent of grams, weighing everything in grams generally, but especially salt, because every salt has a different weight than its volume. So, the difference between Morton's kosher and Diamond Crystal kosher and sea salt fine versus coarse, they all, the same volume amount has radically different weights. And so my general rule of thumb for salting anything is 4 grams to 1 pound, or roughly 450 grams. That is my starting point with pretty much everything. So whether it's a pound of dough, a pound of water, which is about a quart, a pound of meat, a pound of vegetables, that's my starting point. And then I generally add from there. And so that has served me well for a long time. But I also think that, you kind of have to test your way into it. So when I'm making a new baked good, whether that's a pie, a cake, a bread, I will make it with that general, and I also taste the dough. Like I'm that's what I do. I love cookie dough and batters, but anyway, and then bake it, and then find out, how because also depending on the level of rise you get for whatever it is you're baking, you are going to that, you know, the crumb is going to affect the perception of salt on your palate. So if you have a very tight crumb, you will be aware of more of the salt than if you have a very loose or large crumb. So, you know, I think you just have to adjust, but that's always sort of my starting point, the 4 grams to a pound.
Okay. Also for both of you, and we can start with Rick this time, do you have one recipe that they should all try if they don't cook or bake a lot? Now that
Ooh,
seems
okay.
general, so maybe there is a recipe in the book, or if there is a recipe in general you think that everyone should start with.
I mean, there's not a lot of baking in my book. And one of the baked goods is actually a fairly complicated, it's not a complicated bread, it's a complicated assembly. It's pan de muerto, which is Day of the Dead bread, which I love. Also that brioche, just generally, if you want to make that, it's a really delicious bread in and of itself. The assembly is a little more difficult. To me, you know, like I think cookies are generally easy, and I'd start with there, because it's also, to me, with baking, it's also about instant gratification. I know that I can, you know, from 0 to 30, I can have a fresh batch of cookies, and that to me is heaven. And so I think that I would probably start with, you know, a really good chocolate chip recipe. You know, I have some on Bon Appetit and Food Network, depending on what you like. You know, I have complicated chocolate chip and peanut butter recipes. I have not so complicated, the quick and easy. I have thin and crispy. I have, you know, crispy and outsides and chewy insides. You know, there's a multitude. So I think, you know, search for the style of cookie that you like. And also look for a reputable source. And this is not a diss on anyone, but I feel like, you know, if they're not giving you grams, if they're saying things like salt to taste, if they're not telling you the exact amount of dough to portion out, if they're just saying, you know, make little, you know, walnut-sized balls or whatever, like, to me, that's just so not helpful. I mean, you may just like eyeball it and make a ping pong, and I do that too. But, you know,
but also after you've done it many times, right? Like you would maybe eyeball it after you knew. Yeah.
Right. Also, like I've never bought a whole walnut in my entire life. I actually don't know how big a walnut is. But yeah. But so to me, you know, it's like, I'm going to tell you 2 tablespoons, you know, an ounce and a half cookie scoop. I'm going to give you those instructions. I'm going to tell you how long to leave it on the sheet pan before you take it off and put it on your cooling rack, because that will impact the internal texture and the external texture of the cookie. And that to me is a sign of a good baker and a good recipe writer. When you're baking and you're writing for the person that's making it, you know, and the writer may think, oh, I'm going to let you, you know, make it the way you want, season to taste, do this to whatever. No, I'm not. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you as much instruction as possible. And then after that, you kind of go on your own. But I want you to get the best result possible. So I would look for recipes like that. And I think generally magazines and newspapers also test their recipes, which I think is incredibly important, especially in baking. And no shade to bloggers, but, you know, like a blogger might have an oven that is not calibrated correctly, or maybe it's old, or maybe it like cycles really high and the temperatures are off, and that could certainly impact your baking, will certainly impact your baking. So I would look for recipes that are tested, so that you know that you're going to get a good result, or at least have a higher chance of it.
Yeah, I think we both just had a really strong reaction to like, in a dough, salt to taste. Like, no.
What does that even mean? Like,
I know.
Bake your bread and then taste it. And like, oh,
we're also not supposed to advise people eat raw flour. I mean, I definitely do, and so does Rick. So we eat raw flour, but I just mean you probably, they say you shouldn't.
I mean, I turned 50 this year. I have been eating cookie dough since I was
so
like
often. So often.
My
Yes.
mother used to have to chase me out of the kitchen when she made cookies because I would eat all the dough before she could bake it.
All right,
Not
I've got
dead.
one last question for each of you. So quick, short. What is your favorite recipe in your new book? Erin,
Oh boy, it's
I
so hard to
know.
play favorites with my
you
recipe
love all your
maker.
babies. I know. So
One of my favorites is I actually just made it and shared it on Instagram this week. It's a brioche recipe, and I made a version for all 4 seasons. So I made the
Ooh.
winter version this week because I'm kind of in winter. It has caramelized onions and slow cooked cabbage with caraway seeds and Gruyere cheese. And so it's sort of like this pastry. It's really soft, fluffy brioche on the bottom, and then all of this topping. So sort of in the same vein as like a kolache or something like that as well, but it's not
Mm.
fully encased. It's really wide and flat. The summer one is actually my favorite. I top it after it's done baking with some roasted tomatoes and roasted corn and like a small piece of burrata. So then it's again like this whole, so like if pizza was brioche almost. Thank you, Rick.
Oh my God.
Thank you for that deep sigh.
I'm dying. Oh my
It was
God.
it
that
was
sounds so good.
a little snow day here in Kansas City, and I made the winter version of those, and that has been a fun thing for me to basically say, okay, I love this recipe so much, I don't want to just make it one time. I want to be able to make it year round.
yes,
Oh,
and
that
just as it
sounds
says
so
in
good.
chat, we are
Okay.
definitely hungry. Rick,
Yes.
do you have a favorite?
It's not a favorite, but it is something that I make quite often, which I guess maybe that technically would make it my favorite, but it's pollo al pastor. And it's, if you like roast chicken, you're gonna love this. I mean, basically, it is essentially a roast chicken that's been marinated and glazed in it's an achiote paste and garlic and citrus and Mexican oregano. And when you roast it, it gets really, really bright red, and all of the juices then drip into sliced onions and chopped pineapple. And then you can eat it just like that, which I have, or you can make tacos out of it. The first Thanksgiving that I was here in Mazatlan, I had just written that recipe and I couldn't go back home because of the pandemic. And so I stayed here and I decided I'm going to make a turkey al pastor. And so I have a rotisserie on my grill, and I put it in there. I put the turkey on there, did basically all the same things that are written in the chicken recipe, but up the amount for a turkey. It was one of the most incredible turkeys. Now I can't have, now for Thanksgiving, I have to make 2. Like there's the sort of traditional American roasted turkey, and then my pavo al pastor. And people always eat the pavo al pastor first. They're like, let's have tacos with this, with Thanksgiving. So it's super delicious. Highly recommend.
Love that.
Wonderful. I know we didn't get to quite all of the questions we had, but this was so informational and such a joy to listen to both of you and your stories and your love for your cooking. Erin G. McDowell and Rick Martinez, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie.
And thank you again, Rick and Erin, for being here. This was like such a great conversation. And Erin, your biscuits are amazing. So I'm glad you mentioned those earlier.
I want
So,
that
Rick,
turkey so bad right now.
know.
That's all
I want that turkey too. Oh my God, Rick.
I'll trade
I'm,
you
like,
biscuits.
salivating.
Actually, no, I'll trade you the brioche for the turkey.
Deal.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I was like, I need to come over to have some of that. That sounds so delicious.
Yes.
Definitely.
So yes, thank you both again for being here. Thank you, Christy, for moderating. It was a great
Thank
conversation.
you.
And I look forward to
Thank
seeing
you
you
so
soon.
much.
Thanks,
Yep. Thank
everyone.
you. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.